Internet does is to serve as an exchange for information and ideas about the right to information, although we also do some projects. And one of the particularly useful aspects of it is the national groups facing certain challenges put out a request to the list, and then they'll hear responses from groups all over the world about how different countries deal with that issue, and then they can build that into their advocacy or legal campaigns. Just to give one example, a few months ago in Nepal, they were facing a legal fight to try to get access to students' exam sheets. The university was refusing to give students their exam sheets even after they were marked. So they had a legal case about that, and they put a message out to FOIAnet saying, have other people dealt with this? How does this work in your countries? And a lot of other people responded to them and said, in our country we have this in the law, we've had this case, so and so. And then they could incorporate that into their brief. So it's very useful. That's probably its most useful function. Right from the very beginning of FOIAnet, it declared the 28th of September as a day to celebrate and promote the right to information. I was looking at the original memo this morning, and actually I was slightly surprised to see that the title of the first that they had in the original memo was International Freedom of Information, quote, Right to Ask, end quote, Day. Which is rather a mouthful, and I'm glad to say that we moved beyond that. It very quickly became the International Right to Know Day, some people have pointed out, and in the context of drafting the declaration for this meeting, that actually the right to know is a slightly different idea than the right to information, and so I think that this declaration will use the right term. I'm confident they call it the Right to Information Day. That I would support that. I've been asked to speak to the issue of why the 28th of September was given this status as this day, and I think at the beginning it was chosen simply because that was the day that this meeting was held. And that's a normal way to do things. World Press Freedom Day, for example, is the 3rd of May, which was the day that the meeting in Windhoek was held or concluded. But over time, this day has become quite institutionalized. For example, many countries around the world, I was trying to find out exactly how many, and I didn't manage to do that yet, but I'll come back to you on that. But my own country, for example, Canada, have officially recognized that as the Right to Know Day. And the global NGO community, especially through FOIAnet, has concentrated an enormous amount of attention to that day and made it into a very big event in around 65 countries. So this is kind of institutional practice and history behind it, but otherwise it was kind of a random choice of day. Okay, so in the remaining 15 minutes that I have, I'll talk about freedom of information and elections. The freedom of information and revolutions. So that's not my presentation. You'll be pleased to say that I didn't waste 10 minutes figuring this thing out. Okay, so let me start with the fairly obvious. Revolutions are fertile ground for the right to information. In Tunisia and Egypt, where really very little or nothing had been happening on this issue beforehand. Now both countries are heavily engaged in that. But of course you know that here in South Africa because the right to information became part of your constitution and legal package also through a revolution. Sometimes it takes quite a long time, or sometimes in the past it's taken quite a long time after the revolution to achieve right to information legislation. Indonesia, Central and Eastern Europe are examples. It took 10 years in Indonesia. In Central and Eastern Europe it took sometimes 10 to 15 years. I think, though, that we could say that those revolutions happened sometime before the right to information gained the status that it has today. Today we're having this meeting here in every region of the world. There's a lot of groups and attention focused on this issue. Internationally, it has been recognized, by everyone as a human right. So I think that modern revolutions, those that are happening today and in the future, it will be more front and center. Of course, not everyone will be able to foment a revolution, perhaps unfortunately. I'd like to have a bit of a revolution in Canada, actually. No sign of that. So let me also mention that I think slightly analogous to revolutions are moments of significant political change, even if they happen within a constitutional framework. For example, in Mexico, there had been 70 years of rule by one party. So the Egyptians thought they had it bad with Mubarak for 30 years. The Mexicans had PRI for 70 years. And when a new government finally beat the PRI and took over, one of their platforms, which they had promised beforehand, was the right to information. And in a less dramatic sense, I think we could also say the same in the UK. In the UK, there had been 18 years of conservative rule, and during that whole period of 18 years, the Labour Party in opposition, and for quite a lot of those years, without much chance of getting in, had made a right to information a promise, and then when they got in, they delivered it. So moments of significant political change are also important. Okay, let me talk now a little bit about what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. And in Tunisia, immediately after the revolution occurred, the World Bank started negotiating with the government to lend them some money. And the World Bank attaches, the process at the World Bank now is to attach preconditions to loans. So they have certain things that you need to do quickly, because the negotiation period is usually only a few months, before you actually get the loan. And the World Bank managed to convince the government to include adoption of an FOI law as one of these preconditions. So that was sort of happened privately, if you will, between the government and the World Bank. The World Bank then prepared a draft, and Saeed mentioned I was involved in that. I was a consultant to the World Bank working on that issue. Gave the draft to the government. It sort of disappeared into the government black hole. And the next we heard about it, the law had been notified in the Gazette, and that's how we saw what had happened to our draft. It had been changed, and weakened certainly, but still was a pretty good law. And they made some amendments quickly thereafter due to an interesting process, which we can talk about privately. But so they got a fairly good law. The World Bank circulated its draft to civil society, but civil society was sort of really occupied with other things and didn't have a lot of time. Thank you. 3 minutes. I thought it was 10 more minutes. Didn't have a lot of time to focus on it. The government apparently also circulated its draft to civil society, and civil society did make a few comments on that, but not much civil society involved. Okay, in Egypt, it started out very much the same way. Egypt also was looking for a World Bank loan. One of the impacts of the Egyptian revolution was to really take the wind out of their otherwise very, very successful economy, so they were short of money. And again, the government agreed as part of one of the triggers or the preconditions for the loan to adopt the Freedom of Information law. I think that through the process of discussions with the government, they kind of became convinced that this was a good idea anyway. I think in Tunisia they were sort of, oh, whatever, we need to get the loan, let's leave this, it's not a big deal. But I think in Egypt they were feeling a lot of pressure to deliver something concrete to the street, as it were. If you walk into any government office in Egypt, at some point in that conversation will come up this thing about the power of the street, and the bureaucracy's freaked out about the power of the street. The power of the street, of course, was what took down Mubarak, and so they haven't delivered much to the street in terms of concrete democratization. Of course, they're moving towards an election and these sorts of things. So I think the government became convinced that FOI was the right to information law, was a kind of an easy thing to give the street. They were probably going to have to do it anyway, and so I think they internalized the idea. In due course, the government decided that it didn't need the World Bank loan, so that took the pressure off them in terms of the timing of adopting this law, but they were still moving forward in terms of that process. And the process has, and there were quite a lot of consultations with civil society, unlike in Tunisia. The government itself was consulting with civil society. And the process is stalled, and I think there may be several reasons for that, but one of the big reasons is because the government and civil society will not agree or cannot agree on whether the military should be covered by the law. As we all know, of course, it's normal for the military to be covered by these laws, but the Egyptian military is adamant that they shouldn't be. Okay, let me make a few comments about this kind of process. And obviously, this kind of process is different from what a lot of people have said about, even here on this panel, about building grassroots organizations, involving wide civil society coalitions and so on and so forth. These are very top-down processes. Firstly, the window of opportunity. And what we know from the experience of revolutions around the world is that the revolution creates this enormous agenda for change and opportunity for change, a window of opportunity for change, if you will, but that window is very, very short. I can tell you about the experience in Indonesia. In Indonesia, the priority reform after the revolution there in 1998 was to adopt a new press law. The revolution happened in May of 1998. The law was drafted in sort of late 98. There was a major conference in March of 99, which the president opened, so this was a reform with a lot of political will behind it. The law was passed in September of 99, and I firmly, and it was great law, and it's sort of a bulwark of freedom of expression in the country now. I firmly believe that if they had waited 2 more months, the law might not have gotten passed. So you can see the sort of the window, and you could already feel by the time the thing was passed in September that sort of conservatives and the backlash against the revolution was starting to snipe at it. The second, and related to the window of opportunity is this issue of setting priorities. I just want to say that this is a very, very effective way of enforcing time. I've been subjected to a lot of mechanisms to try to get me to shut up in the time that I'm given, the exhaustive ones. And this one is very quiet and very understated, but you feel really embarrassed going over your time and keeping the chair standing behind you. But I'm just going to say a couple more small. Even though I feel embarrassed, my impairment trumps that easily. But related to the window of opportunity is the question of setting priorities. So you have a situation where everything needs to be done after the revolution. Just in the area of freedom of expression, you need the broadcast law reform, you need print law reform, content restrictions need to be changed, and whatever. So and it may not be the first priority of things. So it's really a competition for that. Now, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, and I'll just close with that. Obviously this top-down and to some extent externally driven approach is not ideal. Right? There's very limited civil society involvement usually, and the law, that means the law is not tailored to the country. On the other hand, we heard several people talking about Nigeria. It took 10 years to get the law. In Ghana, in Mali, in Zambia, campaigners have been working for a very long time. They still don't have a law, but Tunisia does have a law. And I think also we can see that in some countries, like in Mexico, for example, it was a very top-down process. Civil society was heavily involved, but only a very top level of civil society. And yet the law has been extremely effective. So I think there are 2 key factors. And then there are some counterexamples of that. For example, in Pakistan, where the Asian Development Bank forced the law through, and the law was the rotten law, and civil society didn't engage. So I think the 2 factors are, first of all, is the law a good one? Getting a quick and dirty if it's no good is not a success. But getting a quick and dirty if it's a good one, I think that's an important factor. And the second one is, will civil society engage? And does civil society, after the law is adopted, engage? And I just was in Tunisia a couple of days ago at a conference on FOI hosted by the journalists, and I think civil society there is starting to engage. And I think we have now this huge international community of people working on FOI which will provide support and help and money and all kinds of things, so that I think the chance that civil society will not engage as they did in Pakistan is much less today. So I think it's an interesting debate whether this is a good process to get laws. I think my own sense, of course, because of my involvement in these things, is that it is.